Hey everybody, it's Dan, and welcome back. This is going to be an unboxing video for the recently released Guards set from Wargames Atlantic's Classic Fantasy line. And this video will also be sponsored by Wargames Atlantic because they were kind enough to send this our way for review purposes. They also sent the simultaneously released Villagers set, which I know there's been a lot of buzz around as well, so I'll be reviewing that in the next day or so as well. And just as a heads up, there were a lot of requests to see how this kit bashes with the Wargames Atlantic medieval foot sergeants specifically, and then likewise people want to know how the villagers kit bash with the peasant levy. So just to let you know in advance, I specifically set aside sprues of each of those sets after reviewing them last month to take a look at kit bash potential with these sets. So we are headed in that direction. If you're not familiar with any of my reviews, welcome, first of all. The normal progression is we're going to take a just briefly look at the box here. We're going to take a look at the sprues in detail and in depth. I'll give you some close-up shots. We'll put some of them together. I'll do some scale comparisons with other miniatures in my collection, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. So once again, big thanks to Wargames Atlantic for sending this our way for review purposes. And I mentioned generally, first of all, Wargames Atlantic sets don't come with bases, so that's just something to be aware of. And also you need to pay attention to the model count. They do seem to be hovering around the 24 model count boxes these days, but sometimes they're going to come with 30, sometimes they even come with 40. It really does just depend. But in this case, we're looking at 24 figures. I will say, from a box art and layout standpoint, just very briefly, I don't like this as much as their medieval line. I think the medieval range layout is their strongest. In fact, I have a box here. Let me just show you the difference just very briefly. I like this because they photoshopped the miniatures. They're close to real size, and it gives you a really good idea of what's coming in the set. Still, like, you know, a nice illustration over on the left, but the miniatures themselves I think are much clearer with this box art, and this carries through with the entire Age of Chivalry line. Whereas the fantasy stuff, you can see the miniatures are a little bit darker, kind of harder to see, and a little bit smaller. So I do prefer the medieval range. And then likewise on the back, this layout is slightly different from the medieval one. If I once again juxtapose them, here's the Age of Chivalry Foot Sergeant's box. So you can see, again, photoshopped and slightly larger. You get a better idea what's coming in at one larger miniature too, and a little blurb on Baron's War, the affiliated game that the miniatures could be used in. So what they've done here is the miniatures are much smaller down at the bottom, and it seems like the affiliated game in this case, Trader's Toll, has a more prominent display. So anyway, it's a box. It's not a huge deal, but I do wish they'd stuck with what they've been doing with the medieval sets. I think that's much more effective for conveying what's going to come inside of the set. But anyway, with that aside, enough about the box. Let's talk about miniatures. You're going to get 4 sprues. Again, I've already unboxed it like I've been doing with most of my reviews. You're going to get 4 sprues of 6 miniatures apiece. Those are your 24 miniatures. And as I said, they're not going to come with any bases, but those are very easy to source online, even through Wargames Atlantic. So you can choose the bases that are correct for whatever system you want to use them for. So 4 identical sprues, so we'll isolate just the one here. And you can see right away, there's a lot of stuff on these sprues, which is what one would hope for kind of like a generic fantasy set that you could use for all kinds of different things, from D&D to the skirmish game that was mentioned on the back. I just want to show you something real quick, because for those that aren't aware, I take pretty extensive notes before I do these reviews, just so I can go through and understand what's on the set. And normally we're talking about like 10 minutes of work and maybe a paragraph of notes. Like, these are my notes for this set, and it took me like 45 minutes to go through. So that's should just give you some idea of just how much is in this box. So let's do a quick overview shot here, so you can see kind of the layout of the sprue, and I'm going to go through some of these bits in detail here. So the normal layout for Wargames Atlantic here is you've got 5 or 6 bodies in the center. In this case, it's 6 bodies toward the center of the sprue. Weapons and accessories kind of flank that. And then you've got heads on either side of the sprue. And we'll go through a specific breakdown of all of those individual things, but we'll start with bodies, heads, arms, and accessories. That's typically how I flow through these sprues. So again, there's 6 bodies. It's interesting, though, because we're going with fantasy. There are, of course, historical influences, and I think some would agree that some of these look kind of like 13th century medieval. Some of them look more like 15th, 16th century medieval. and then some of them look just kind of generic fantasy to me. Of course, anything could be fantasy, but as I mentioned, I think there are some specific historical influences here. So we'll flow around the sprue here. So we've got this guy up here, and the sculpting is fantastic as ever. It's really nice, crisp, clean, no mold lines or anything like that. You got this guy up here, and it's a good mix of like boot and armor designs here. Again, this is more like, again, 13th century kind of medieval, looks very similar to the foot sergeants. There's this guy here, which I would call more just generic fantasy, but if anything, it would be kind of 12th, 13th century medieval. This guy here, which is more like War of the Roses, right? So we're into like the 16th century here. Very similar in terms of design to like the Perry Miniatures War of the Roses Foot Knights. And let me flip the sprue here just both so you can see the backs here and see all the nice sculpting. Got some belts sculpted on. And you can see the armor design carries through onto the back. And I'm very impressed with this, to be honest, just to focus on this one in particular. Somebody in the comments on one of my prior videos mentioned that they would like to see a like War of the Roses era kit from Wargames and Atlantic. And at first I thought, I don't know, because like the Perrys have that pretty well cornered. But seeing this, how successful I think this is, I think they could do a really good job with just a set of generic foot knights of that era. And then I mentioned I flipped it over both to see the backs of these, but also because you can see there's one two-part figure on this sprue. Everything else is combined in one, but this one has a cloak, and you can see its plate armor here, which would attach onto these legs. And while I've got it flipped, might as well come back over here. So again, you got some more plate greaves down here. And then we're back into kind of like 13th, maybe 14th century attire here. Again, this guy looks like he's straight out of the Foot Knights. And then this guy, if I flip him, looks a little bit more generic fantasy. Kind of a blending of time periods here. I also like that they are venturing into different like body types and sizes. I really appreciate that, especially now that we're delving into like a fantasy setting where you might win somebody taller, you might win somebody more plump, things of that nature. So it's cool to see that. So yeah, I think the sculpting is really, really fantastic here on these bodies. And at least initially, my thoughts are that I think these are going to blend quite nicely. Certainly some of the bodies specifically are going to blend quite nicely with the foot sergeants. So with that done, let's take a look at heads, because there's a pretty staggering number of heads. So again, I mentioned, just to take it back for a second, you got heads down here and you got heads over here. And in total, what we have are 26 heads that I've done my best to categorize, but 26 heads per sprue. And they are broken up, I think, like this. So there are, to my surprise, 5 female heads. So if I zoom in here without getting it blurry, you can see there's 5 heads that are female, which is cool because if I pan back so you can see the bodies again, there are a couple of bodies that I think could be used for women. It's nice not to see like, you know, sculpted breastplate armor or anything like that, because that wouldn't necessarily have been historically correct, but certainly in a fantasy setting, it's refreshing to see. Again, any of these bodies, I think, would go nicely with some of these heads. So that's pretty cool. And a good mix. You've got kind of like a Dark Age helmet here, kettle helm. And if I flip this, there's 2 bear heads. And then one head that I'm going to refer to here as kind of like a Stark, House Stark from Game of Thrones, as sort of the generic fantasy interpretation there. There are 3 bear heads, male heads. Again, there's 5 female heads per sprue. There's 3 male heads that are bear, like no helmet or hat or anything like that. Good mix of facial hair here. I'll flip this guy so you can see him as well. As always, nice sculpting on the faces here. Some of their earlier kits, the eyes I think were too puffy. I noticed that on like their Dark Age Irish, but they seem to have fixed that with more recent kits. I think that the faces are pretty convincing. So again, 3 bear heads. We have 2 hat heads, like kind of like a skull cap. So there's this one here. This looks very similar to some of the heads that we would see in the medieval peasant levy set. So there's one up here, and then if I jump down to the bottom of the sprue, there's one more down here. So 2 of those kind of like padded medieval style hats, if you will. And then there are 6 kettle helms, male kettle helms. So those are located here. So there's 4 of them here. Again, a very nice mix of not only like expressions, but facial hair, and even like look at this, the difference in size of the heads, right? You got this one kind of like a bulkier looking guy, which I think would look very nice like on this body here. And this is something that I've only otherwise really seen Victrix do, like with some of their Dark Age sets, that they play around with different body sizes, which I think look really cool in units. So 4 of them are here, and then 2 of them are located up here. And keen-eyed observers will notice that the style of the helm is slightly different than the kettle helms that we saw in the Foot Sergeant sprue. Again, we will be doing some kit bashing toward the end here, but from there, again, there are 6 of those kettle helms that I mentioned, and then there are 5 of the male, again, I'll refer to them as like House Stark, kind of generic high fantasy, is what you've got down here. So 3 of them here, and then we have 2 more over here. This one I realize is slightly different. Maybe it's just because the face is a little bit bigger. But I would say it's 5 of those. And you've got 2 that are visored, kind of Renaissance style. This one's a little bit more fantasy for me. But you got 1 closed visor and 1 open. And then there are 2 kind of Dark Age, early medieval heads here. And then up here at the top, rounding it out again, there's 26 total heads. There's 1 kind of fantasy Warhammer Empire head here with a nice plume of feathers. So there you go, a really, really, I think, strong, fantastic mix of head types to represent a pretty wide variety of fantasy tropes, if you will. Arms get interesting now too. So because these are specifically designed for skirmish level play, unlike the Foot Sergeants, for example, which deliberately come so that like you could arm them all with spears or you could arm them all with swords, this is a good blend of different weapon types, more akin to what you would want for like D&D or, again, skirmish level games. So I'll break it up into right arms, left arms. I think that's probably the best way to do this. So we'll start with right arms. You have 3 swords scattered across the sprue here. So there's this one here. And again, the sculpting, I think, for all of it is really fantastic. So 3 just regular kind of arming swords. There's one here. And there's one up here in a slightly different style. Right? There's 2 maces. And we are going to be jumping all over the sprue here just so you're prepared. But I will try to make it as non-disorienting as I can. So 2 maces, there's 1 located down here, and there's 1 in more of an at-rest pose up here. There's 1 greatsword, which is in a at-rest pose, which you can see right here. Again, we're still on right arms. There's 1 axe, just like a hand axe, down here. There's 2 halberds, which you might have seen up here. Both of them are sort of at-rest poses, I think. Good for guards. There's 1 scroll, like holding up a scroll. I don't want to flip the sprue over, but you can see it right here. Holding up a piece of parchment. And then there's 1 hand, 1 right hand that is empty. Just an empty right hand, which appears to be this one here. So from there are, for left arms, there is 1 sword that is at rest, and that's this one down here, which I think is pretty cool. Like in the scabbard, resting it on the sword. There's 1 torch, just a little bit over to the right on the sprue there. And I think the flames are particularly well rendered there. There's 1 that's holding up a lantern up here by the scroll. Right, there's 1 dagger, which seems, at least from the glove, like it's specifically designed to go with this guy, but I think it's, most of the hands have gloves, it looks like, so I think they could blend pretty well. There's 1 that's holding a chain back down here at the bottom. 6 of them are empty. I'm not going to point them all out, but you can see them kind of scattered around. There's 6 empty left hands, and then there's 1 left hand that is in a pointing pose right here. Right? And there's 2 two-handed weapons. There's a bow and a crossbow right down here. Right? And then I think it's up here. There's a knocking arrow that could go with that bow if you like. That is up here. So that's it for arms. I say that's it, but that's a ton of options per 6 bodies, right? And again, everything that I've mentioned in terms of numbers is per sprue, so you have to multiply it by 4 to figure out what's going to come inside of the kit. For accessories, it's a lot of one-off stuff, but I'll kind of just work around this rather than jumping around like we did with weapons. But there's a lot of really cool accessories that are located throughout the sprue. So you got like some rope, some chain. This I am going to flip the sprue for so you can see because it's really cool. It's a little set of keys, like jailer's keys, right? Flip it back over. And then you got a quiver bolts, specifically a pouch. This is neat. It's a nice little like bundle of weapons. Goose. I don't know why. Sometimes I feel like the designers like had a little bit of space and are just having some fun. Throw that on. You got a quiver of arrows, a shield up here, a little treasure chest, dagger, and then there's a feather, some other small bits and bobs, and then these two pauldrons are what they look like. You can see that they're concave on the inside, so they can go over a shoulder very easily, I think. So yeah, a really, really, I think, fantastic kit for making generic fantasy soldiers, and gives you such an array of options that you could really, I think, represent, you know, a ton of different fantasy worlds and games. I think the only two like demerits for me are minor ones, and those are that I wish that the shield didn't have a sculpted design on it already. It's a cool design, for whatever that's worth. There's also one of the bodies, I think, yeah, it's this one here, that has that design sculpted on, and it's easy enough to file it off, but I would prefer it just to be blank, and then I can add whatever design I want. And also that the cloak on this one, I mean, it's very difficult to do, but I wish it was optional for this two-part guy here. But again, minor quibbles. It's certainly not anything that seriously detracts from the set. So yeah, very, very strong, at least looking at it on the sprue. So with that in mind, let's cut some of these off. I want to put some of these figures together. As I mentioned, I want to kit bash with the foot sergeants and show you how those look, and then we'll do some scale comparisons. All right, so I've built a bunch of these figures now. I have 3 that I have done straight out of the box. I have 2 that I've kit bashed with arms and heads from foot sergeants, and then I have some foot sergeants that I've converted up with bits from this kit. So first, let's look at the models straight out of the box. So here's one that I've done up as like a Empire captain, which I think looks pretty neat. Similar to one of the guys on the box. Here's just a generic town guardsman. Again, very similar in style to the foot sergeants. And here's like a jailer, I guess. So again, those 3 were built just out of bits from this kit. Now let's look at 2 models that are using the bodies from the guards set, but arms and heads from the foot sergeants. And I think you'll agree that they are the same size. Now, I do have one commentary on the heads specifically. I think the arms are totally interchangeable. There's no problem. But I do recommend, if you're doing these conversions, that you stick to the heads from the guard set, because here are 2 side by side. So on the left, let me get it non-blurry. On the left, that is the foot sergeant kettle helm. And on the right, that's a guard's kettle helm. And you see I mean, we're talking like millimeters here, but you see the difference in the neck thickness. So what that causes is heads from the foot sergeant kit sit a little bit lower on the bodies from the guard set. I still think it's convincing enough at the tabletop level, but if that kind of thing bothers you, then you'd be better off, I think, sticking to heads from the guard set and just using arms from the foot sergeants if you like. But yeah, this looks like a model from the foot sergeant's kit, I think. And then here's another one. So this is, again, a body from the guards, and then the arms and head are both from the foot sergeants. And once again, you can see that I think the head's sitting a little bit low just because of how much of the neck is cut off from the foot sergeant's kit. So you're better off finding a comparable head, just sticking to the guards' heads, I think. But otherwise, I think that's a pretty cool conversion. The scale is all exactly the same. And then we're going in the opposite direction now. So these bodies are from the foot sergeant kit, and then the arms and head are from the guards set. And notice too, I had mentioned that I thought most of the hands had gloves, but what I realized is that all of the hands in the guard set do have gloves, which makes all the left and right hands interchangeable. Just something else to be aware of. So I went with like a House Stark head here. Again, this is a body from the Foot Sergeant kit, and then arms and a head from the Guard set. It's conversion 1, and then the same thing here. Bodies from the Foot Sergeants, the head and arm, or at least the right arm, are from the Guard set. So you can see conversions going in this direction I think are a little bit more convincing, but generally speaking, my recommendation is to stick to the heads for their respective kits, and then just swap arms. And then for scale purposes, I brought out these are just regular Foot Sergeant models, but I wanted to show you kind of like side by side what these would look like if you mixed them up in a unit. Again, we'll do proper scale comparisons here in just a minute, but these kits I thought deserved kind of special treatment. But you can see they're the exact same height. So I think these would blend together really, really nicely. One final thing, just as sort of a proof of concept, this is a body from the Guard set. Scabbard and the head are from the Guard set. The arms are leftover arms from my Perry Foot Knights, just as, again, kind of a proof of concept for Wargames Atlantic if they wanted to dabble in some War of the Roses, or even just generic, 16th century Foot Knights. I think they could do a really good job. So there you go. Let me get reorganized here. I want to bring in lots of other models from different manufacturers, and we'll do some proper scale comparisons here. All right, so I've got a bunch of manufacturers on the Lazy Susan here that I want to compare to these figures that we just built together. So this is going to be every 4th figure will be a Wargames Atlantic Guard model, and then I'll move slowly and I'll call out the different manufacturers as they come up. So starting here in the center, we've got, again, a Wargames Atlantic Guard. This is a Reaper Human. Games Workshop Human, 7th edition of Fantasy. Warlord Games, another Guard. Games Workshop Lord of the Rings. Victrix, Cool Mini or Not. Guard. Perry Miniatures. Mantic. Fireforge Games. Guard. This is Wargames Atlantic Peasant Levy. Gripping Beast. Oathmark Human. Wargames Atlantic Guard. So what's the verdict? I think this is a really fantastic kit, and not only is it going to be substantially cheaper per model than any of the other comparable sets from other manufacturers, but I think that the variety that you can get in this kit is probably the strongest of any of the sets that I've dealt with, kind of delving into this space. So really, really, really strong entry from them, and I think definitely the strongest fantasy entry that we've seen from Wargames Atlantic to date. So if you are finding these reviews helpful and you were thinking about picking up any sets based on them, I would be very grateful if you'd consider using our affiliate link in the description. You'll not only save 10% on your order, but a portion of your proceeds will come back to directly supporting this channel. And a huge thanks to those who have done so far, because your orders have already fueled some reviews that will be upcoming. So appreciate you all. As I said, we're gonna have the Villagers set coming out probably in the next day or two, just behind this one, so stay tuned for that. As ever, in the meantime, I appreciate you dropping by for this one. Until next time, happy gaming.